Greetings, my guzzlers. I'm a fan of nuts, but I wasn't actually shopping for nuts, but I was shopping for something else, and I came across this bag of pecans produced, and I thought, I want to make a pecan pie. So I bought these, and then I thought, hang on, I don't just want to make any old pecan pie. I want to do it properly. So I thought, let's find out what original pecan pie was like. So I turned to Max Miller first, Tasting History, and he did one on pecan pie. And then I went off and done a little bit of research as well. And I'm going to make a pretty much original pecan pie from America, which is a little bit different to their modern day pecan pies. So we're going to make a pecan pie. Now this recipe requires like a pie crust. Okay, so we're going to make a classic short crust pastry to line this flan dish. Okay, and the recipe I'm following now might have been Mary Berries, I can't remember, but they're all basically the same, aren't they? So in here I've got just some plain flour, 250 grams, and then I've got some diced and chilled butter, unsalted, 125 grams. And we start by rubbing that into the flour and sort of blending it in. Try not to warm it up too much, which is a little bit difficult when you've got warm hands, isn't it? But we just want to get that all sort of like broken up into like breadcrumbs. Now this dough will rest or will chill for 30 minutes, so there's no need to put the oven on yet. We're going to add a pinch of salt in a minute, and we're going to add 1 to 3 tablespoons of milk or water, but we want to err on the lesser side rather than on the more. Okay, so I'm just going to carry on getting that all crumbed in. I'm now just going to measure out a tablespoon of milk, and we want to use that milk later when we make the pecan pie. Okay, hence I'm keeping that spoon there in that jug. And what we want to do now is start mixing this all together till it comes through to a nice dough. Now you want to avoid putting too much liquid in, because the more you put in, the harder your pastry is going to be, and we don't really want our pastry, don't we? So that's 2 gone in there. Now once I've got that, so it's all coming together as a nice dough that we will eventually be able to roll. Okay, we don't want it crumbling too much, because obviously we won't be able to roll it very easily. I'm then going to remove it from the bowl and wrap it in cling film, and it's going to go in the fridge for 30 minutes. Now during that time you want to put your oven on, and you're going to bake it, blind bake it to begin with. So ideally you want some baking beans. We're going to bake it at 200 Celsius. I think I might just add a drop more milk. It's still a little bit dry, a little bit crumbly, but I certainly don't want another tablespoon. And then like I say, preheat oven to 200, and we're going to be doing a double bake as it was. My dough sort of lightly chilled, and what I want to do is now just roll this out. If, by the way, you can alter the quantities that you make. I'm just wondering, actually, I think I might lightly flour my surface because I think that's going to be a bugger to pick up. If you want to change quantities, it's quite easy. It's just half factor flour. So you just using that ratio, adjust as needed. So why a pecan pie? Well, I told you why. It's partly because I bought them pecans cheap. But it is essentially a classic American pie. We need a bit more flour. And it's simply because pecans are native to America, specifically along the Mississippi River. It's a type of hickory, apparently. And the nut was used quite extensively by sort of, well, I don't know if, would you call them Native Americans, but the natives to that area, because part of it is sort of Mexico. But certain tribes used to use them and trade them. And when the Europeans come over, the Spanish, they were often given these pecans as well, and that's how they ended up becoming sort of, or ended up going elsewhere, if you like. Right, now I'm doing a little bit flat. I've got a feeling this is going to be a bugger to pick this up. So we essentially want it big enough that we can fit it in the tin outside, and we ideally don't want to split anything. We want to be able to fold it down into there nice and neat. So you will notice I didn't show you me actually lifting that up, and it did actually surprisingly. I used a dough scraper underneath it to lift it up, and it worked really well. It has unfortunately split in a few places, so what I'm going to do is just trimming round the top, and then we're just going to patch it. Now we're going to be pouring our sort of pie mixture in there, and we obviously don't want it leaking. You'll notice I'm using a porous pie dish or flan dish or whatever you want to call it. You don't have to have one of those. Okay. But what you haven't noticed, unless you were paying a lot of careful attention, is that I didn't grease this. You don't want to get grease in it. It should, famous last words, it should lift out quite nice and cleanly on its own. So I think I've just about sort of patched the holes. So now I'm just going to trim it off, and then check my oven is up to temperature, so we can blind bake it for about 12 minutes. So like I said, just going to cover it over with some foil, add some baking beans, and then we're just going to blind bake that. And then in there, blind bake that for 12 minutes. And then we'll be bringing it out, removing the beans, and then finishing it off. Weighed out here 60 grams of pecans, and they're going to go into the actual pie, but we are using the remainder, or a lot of the remainder, to do a decoration. The original recipe said about using the pecan halves to decorate as you like. You don't have to, you could just add some, or you could cover the whole pie, it's up to you. The traditional method, or recipe rather, comes from the tried recipes of the Christian Science Monitor, or the one I'm using anyway, March 24th, 1914. And this adds a meringue topping. It doesn't really sort of explain, or there aren't any pictures of how you should do the meringue. So Max opted for a bit in the middle. You can spread it over the entire surface. I'm in two minds as to how much to do, because if we're going to decorate with the pecans, we want to at least see the decoration, don't we? So those 60 grams are going to go in my little blender, and we just basically want to break them down, not quite like a flour, but sort of, I suppose, more like breadcrumbs. One more little blitz. Technically speaking, pecan isn't a nut. It's what they call a drupe. It's a fruit that has a single stone or pit inside. Okay, there are other nuts that we talk about that are similar. They're not really nuts, but there you go. So, I said to you it's native to America. But the 16th century, pecans were then sort of traded with Europe, and people planted pecan trees. But the pecan is sort of, you know, original, exclusive to America. So my pie crust is about 7 minutes left to go. Okay, so we're not actually going to make up it's almost like a custardy type filling. Now, more modern and your traditional pecan pies today are done with syrup or molasses, but more often not syrup, and that's simply because of a company that chose to use their syrup that way, and it became the classic pecan pie. But it is obviously very sweet. It's very much like what we in England like, well, I like it, treacle tart. This was pre the syrup days. Okay, so it's got sugar in it. So I've got here some soft brown sugar. I've got 220 grams of that. I've got some caster sugar, but that's actually from a meringue. You're going to want 3 whole eggs, about a tablespoon of flour, and a pinch of salt, and the milk, about 235 mils of milk, and we're going to use that, mix that all together along with those crushed nuts, as it were, and then we're going to gently heat that, and that will go into our cooled pie crust. So we want that to be cool before we pour that in there, so we won't actually make that up. And we're now just going to put that back in there for about 5 more minutes. Okay, until that sort of the bottom starts going a bit sort of golden, and at which point we're going to bring it out, let it cool, and we're going to turn our oven down to about 160, 165. And then while that's cooling, we'll get on with making the pie mixture. I said to you about trees and the pecans and that. In 1919, Texas said the pecan tree was the state tree. They seem to like state this, state that. In 2001, the pecan was the official state health nut. In 2013, it was pecan pie became the state's official state pie. Not steak pie, state pie. So various other countries, states do say, you know, the pecan is their state tree or whatever, but Texas is generally sort of that area where it's thought to be that. I said to you about people spreading them, taking them out of Europe. They also spread throughout America. For instance, Thomas Jefferson planted pecan trees up in his plantations in Virginia. George Washington reported that Jefferson gave him Illinois nuts, which were basically pecans. That Washington then used them and grew in his Virginia own. So there you go, that's how the tree spread. So I'll tell you a little bit more about pecan pie once we get on to making it up. Right, so like I said, we're making the sort of original sort of tart recipe. Appears about the earliest recorded recipe is about 1886, which is well before the time Caro syrups tried to argue that they invented the pecan pie with their syrup. But back then, like we are now, it was basically eggs, butter and sugar, sometimes corn syrup, but it can be white sugar, brown sugar, cane sugar, maple syrups now, like I say, it can be anything. But anyway, we're doing the more traditional one. So I've got a tablespoon of flour in there. I'm putting those ground up pecans into there. I've got my soft brown sugar, I think I said I've got 220 grams of that. We then want 3 eggs, which we're going to just break in there. And like I say, we're going to want some egg whites later if we're going to decorate with meringue. Probably will do, you don't have to. In they go. There you go, there. Oh, got to watch that, it's a bit warm. And then 235 mils of milk. Now you could do this directly into the saucepan if you wanted, but I'm just going to get this all mixed together in a bowl, and then you're going to want a saucepan and a low heat. Now I'm going to use a spatula in that saucepan because you need to make sure, obviously, we get into all the nooks and crannies when we stir it. Otherwise, it's obviously not going to cook properly, and you've got to do it on a nice low heat. Else, what you end up creating is a scrambled nutty egg mixture. What we really want to do is form more like a custard mixture. So that's all going into there. So I'll put it on a low heat, feather, I don't know where that came from, and I'm just going to make sure I keep stirring that, and we're just going to gently warm that up until it's just starting to thicken, at which point we're then going to continue for about another 7 minutes. So I was saying to you about Caro syrups. They wanted some, more ways in which they could get people using their, their syrups, and they came up with this story that the wife of one of the sort of executives was thinking, oh, what could I use corn syrup, our magical corn syrup for, or their syrup anyway, and she claimed that she sort of, her recipe was for the classic pecan pie, but like I said, we already know there were pecan pies before then, so they may well have invented it using their syrup, but it was more of a marketing ploy than anything else. Pecan pie is eaten all over America, things like Thanksgiving and things like that. It's one of the classic sort of things they'll eat at that time of year and that sort of thing. But it has, since the 40s, really, 1940s, been classically associated with, the southern states of America. In England or Europe, we have, like I said, treacle tarts, which is similar, it just doesn't have pecan nuts in it. And there is a thing known as chess pie, which I've never heard of before, which apparently this is sort of, or a chess pie is a variation of this sort of pecan pie. So really, that's the history, if you like, of the pecan nut and the pecan pie. So I'm just going to, like I say, bring this up, get the heat up, keeping stirring. We don't want it scrambling. And then we're going to cook it on for another 7 minutes, when we'll then be ready to pour it into our base. Now, the oven's been reduced. We want that down to about 165. And we've got our spare pecans there ready to decorate. That's had 7 minutes. It doesn't thicken a great deal. Okay, and at this point we're now just going to pour that into our pie crust. And this is where, if you are now going to decorate it with your pecans, this is when you do. So get some of your halves. You can start by just going around the edges. You can do the whole pie. It's really up to you, and also how many extra nuts you've got. So once you've decorated it to your liking, it's then going to go back into that oven, where you're going to then bake it for about 30 to 35 minutes. You're looking that there might be a slight wobble in the middle. Whoops. Oh well, there's one extra gone in there. I'm putting fingers in there and getting that out. So I'm just going to continue round, and I might put some more in the middle, but then we'll get baking it. So like I say, that's going to go back in that oven now, and we're just going to cook that for 30 to 35 minutes until, like I say, there's a very slight wobble in the middle. So that's had 30 minutes. Haven't really got a wobble on there, although if I press it lightly I can feel it's a little bit soft in the middle. And so now we're going to let that just cool completely before we decorate it with our meringue. So our meringue, we're going to use 2 egg whites, 3 tablespoons of caster sugar, and what we're going to do is put the meringue, we'll make it into a piping bag and just pipe it on top. Now that's made like your traditional pie. One little mention that I hadn't sort of said so far is about pecan tasses. Now pecan tasses traditionally they're just mini ones, and they're baked traditionally in a small cup, but more often than not now they'll be baked in like muffin tins. The recipe for these first appeared in about the 1950s and 60s, and actually featured in the film Steel Magnolias, which I've never watched, and I've no idea what it's about. But it featured in that film, and it's like, well, where's the name come from? You know, why are we calling these pecan tasses? And it's believed it could be a derivative of the Scottish word for a little cup or glass, which was a tassie, or it could be from the French, which a small cup is la tasse. So anyway, just got to let that cool, and then we'll get back and we'll make some meringue. So here's our almost cooled pie, and like I said, this recipe came with a meringue topping. It didn't really describe quite how to do it. It will sort of spread your meringue on top. Did it mean the whole thing or not? It seems a bit pointless covering the whole thing when you just decorate it with nuts. So we're just going to put some in the middle here as such. So I've got 2 egg whites. I've degreased everything. 2 egg whites, and we're just going to whisk this up until there's soft peaks, and at which point we'll then slowly add in the sugar. We'll gradually add in the sugar, whisking it all in until we get nice stiff peaks, and at which point I'll transfer it to the piping bag. So now I'm just going to pipe my meringue round the centre like that, and I think I might just add few little rosettes, and then, like I say, that's now going to go, a bit of a gap there, back in that oven for about another 12 minutes until that meringue starts browning on top. So here we go, it's out the oven, not fully cooled, but I've transferred it onto a plate, removed the tin and everything. It's still quite hot. So the next step, taste it. As it happened, I didn't get much meringue coming for that, but let's give it a taste. Still quite warm, and so I think it needs a little bit of time to cool down a set. I think it might actually be better if it was chilled a bit as well. But it's sweet, but not overly so. Obviously very nutty, but then again, we've got lots of whole nuts in it, halves, as well as that ground up base. It does taste a little bit eggy, sort of. I mean, the overwhelming flavour is the pecan and sugar, but in a way it's a bit reminiscent of a custard tart, if you know what one of them is. But completely different flavour, obviously. Pastry is nice and light, it's quite thin, so again that's not an issue, but there you go. An original Texan pecan pie from 1914. Very nice.